Obsession rewires your brain. Not all at once, but slowly and quietly, until the way that you think no longer feels like a choice. What begins as passion sharpens into fixation. What starts as love, ambition, or the hunger for something more slowly narrows your world until everything else fades into background noise. And that's the dark part of obsession. It feels productive. It feels purposeful. In a world that constantly tells us to want more, obsession often masquerades as dedication. We praise it when it looks like grinding, when it looks like sacrifice, when it looks like someone willing to give up sleep and comfort or relationships for a goal. But that's only one edge of the blade. Because obsession doesn't know when to let go, whether it's yearning for another person, the need to prove your worth, or the relentless chase for success. Obsession eventually turns inward. It becomes a prison of the mind, one that traps thoughts, replays memories, and forces the same questions to loop endlessly without ever offering an answer. You don't move forward, you circle. You don't heal, you relive. And the more you return to it, the more it hurts. This is where obsession reveals its darker nature. It drowns its victims in their own intensity. It convinces them that the suffering is meaningful, that pain is necessary, and that letting go would somehow make everything pointless. What once gave life direction now consumes it entirely. Many stories throughout anime explore the dangers of obsession, how easily devotion curdles into self-destruction, and how thin the line is between purpose and ruin. These stories don't just warn us about obsession, they reflect something uncomfortably familiar back at us. And by the end of this video, I'll have hoped to have answered this one question. At what point does obsession stop being the thing that saves us and start becoming the thing that destroys us? Obsession doesn't always look like rage or hunger. Sometimes it disguises itself as hope, as effort, as the quiet, desperate belief that if you just try harder, if you just endure more pain, everything will somehow make sense. This kind of obsession isn't loud. It doesn't burn cities or draw swords. It grinds a person down slowly, convincing them that suffering is proof of progress, and that failure simply means that they haven't suffered enough. This is the most dangerous form of obsession, the one that convinces someone that they are growing, when in reality, they are only repeating the same wounds in different ways. It turns resilience into self-punishment. It turns responsibility into blame. And it creates a loop where every mistake becomes a personal indictment, every setback a confirmation that worth must still be earned. This is the kind of obsession that haunts Subaru Natsuki from Re:Zero. Subaru enters the story already hollowed out. Long before his seemingly eternal death loop, Subaru is a person who believes that he is nothing. His obsession doesn't begin with love, it begins with fear. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being forgotten, fear that there is nothing about him worth choosing. And when Subaru first meets Emilia, she is kind to him at his lowest point. Not heroic kindness, not destiny-altering kindness, just simple human decency. But for someone like Subaru, who's already hollowed out, that moment lands with heavy weight. Her kindness doesn't just comfort him, it redefines him. She becomes the proof that he matters. And once a person ties their worth to another's gaze, obsession is no longer a possibility. It's inevitable. Subaru doesn't fall in love with Amelia for who she is. He falls in love with her for what she represents. Salvation, purpose, justification. She becomes an altar on which he places his self-worth. To protect her is to validate himself. To suffer for her is to make his pain meaningful. To die for her is to turn his otherwise empty life into something that resembles value. This is not devotion, it's transactional obsession. Subaru convinces himself that endurance is currency, that pain earns affection, and that his sacrifice demands reward. This is where his obsession mutates into something darker. Subaru's repeated deaths begin to function less as tragedy and more as proof. Each reset reinforces the belief that suffering is his role, that agony is the price he must pay to stay relevant in Amelia's life. He doesn't ask whether she needs these sacrifices, he assumes that they are owed. And when Amelia doesn't respond with gratitude or affection, Subaru collapses inward. Not because he is rejected, but because the structure holding his identity together finally breaks. His despair is not romantic, it is existential. If Amelia doesn't validate him, then what remains? This is one of the cores of Subaru's inferiority complex. Living in the shadow of an accomplished father, Subaru learned early on that simply existing wasn't just enough. He internalized the idea that worth must be proven, that being loved requires performance. So when he is transported to another world, that belief does not disappear, it intensifies. The new fantasy setting doesn't free him, it gives his insecurity sharper tools. Return by Death becomes an instrument of his obsession, a power that allows him to brute force meaning into a life that he believes has none. Subaru's fixation on protecting others often hides itself as altruism. On the surface, he is selfless, throwing himself into impossible odds, absorbing pain that no one else has to remember. But beneath the surface is something more troubling, a desire for control. Subaru wants the world to acknowledge him, to need him, to bend around his suffering in a way that proves his significance. He does not simply want to save people, he wants their salvation to justify him. This is why his obsession is so destructive. Subaru's need to be indispensable blinds him to the emotional damage that he causes. He lies, manipulates, and overextends himself, convinced that the ends will absolve the means. He treats fate like an enemy to be beaten into submission, ignoring the fact that people are not problems to be solved. Amelia, in particular, becomes trapped in his internal narrative. She becomes a symbol rather than a person. Her pain, her boundaries, her sense of worth all become secondary to the role that she plays in Subaru's story. And when she resists that role, Subaru reacts with bitterness rather than understanding. And the most unsettling aspect of his obsession is how convincing it feels. His suffering is real, his fear is real, his love, in its own way, is real. But sincerity doesn't absolve harm. His obsession thrives because it feels justified from the inside. Subaru believes that without Amelia, he is nothing. That belief drives him to acts of bravery and acts of cruelty. It pushes him forward and corrodes him at the same time. Obsession, in this sense, is a closed loop. Subaru keeps returning to the same questions. Why am I here? What am I worth? Who would choose me? But he keeps seeking the answers in the same place every time. And every time that answer fails to satisfy him, he suffers more, he tries harder, he sacrifices deeper. The loop tightens, the prison narrows. What makes Subaru's arc compelling is not that he suffers, but that his suffering is not portrayed as noble by default. Pain doesn't make him righteous. Death doesn't make him entitled. ReZero refuses the fantasy that enduring more automatically makes someone better. Instead, it exposes the rot at the center of obsession, the belief that identity can be outsourced to another person. At its core, Subaru's fixation on Emilia isn't about her. It's about the terror of standing alone with himself. Emilia is a mirror that reflects a version of Subaru that he wants to believe in. A hero, a savior, someone irreplaceable. And without that reflection, he is forced to confront the version of himself that he despises. Insecure, powerless, ordinary. Obsession allows him to avoid that confrontation by giving his life a singular focus. But focus isn't the same as meaning. As Subaru grows, the narrative begins to dismantle the illusion that obsession can sustain him. True progress only occurs when he starts separating his worth from his suffering, his identity from his sacrifices, and Emilia from the role that he assigned her. This shift is agonizing because obsession feels safer than self-acceptance. It is easier to die for someone than to live as yourself without guarantees. Subaru's journey illustrates the darkest truth about obsession. It is not born from love, but from fear. Fear of insignificance, fear of rejection, fear of loneliness, fear that if stripped of devotion and struggle, there would be nothing left. Obsession promises escape from that fear, but delivers only deeper confinement. Subaru's greatest enemy is not fate, not time, not even despair. It is the belief that he must earn the right to exist through suffering. And until that belief is confronted, obsession will always feel like purpose, right up until it becomes his cage. Obsession often begins where grief refuses to move forward. It is not simply the desire to retaliate, it is the need to anchor one's entire existence to a single wound. When pain feels too vast to hold, obsession condenses it into something narrow and controllable. Every thought, every action, every breath starts orbiting the same point, as if fixation itself couldn't keep the past from collapsing inward and swallowing everything else. What makes this obsession dangerous is how convincingly it imitates purpose. It provides structure to chaos and direction to suffering, creating the illusion that endurance alone is meaningful. The self becomes secondary to the goal. Identity is postponed until the moment that your goals are achieved. In this state, reflection is replaced by repetition, and healing is mistaken for perseverance. Obsession doesn't ask whether the wound is closing, it only asks whether the hatred is still intact. This is the obsession that haunts Thorfinn Karlsefni from Vinland Saga. He wasn't born with hatred in his heart. It was placed there, violently, at the moment that he watches his father die. From that instant forward, his life collapsed into a single suffocating line. Everything that once gave shape to his world, family, innocence, curiosity, is burned away and replaced with one directive: kill Askeladd with his own two hands. Revenge doesn't merely motivate Thorfinn, it becomes him. This is what makes his obsession so quietly devastating. Thorfinn does not pursue revenge alongside a life. Revenge is his life. He doesn't fight to protect something meaningful, nor to survive towards a future. He fights to preserve a wound. Every battle, every kill, Every scar only exists to keep his hatred alive long enough to justify his continued existence. In this sense, revenge isn't a weapon, it is a life support system. To stay close with his obsession, Thorfinn binds himself to the very man that he despises. He follows Askeladd not as a soldier seeking honor, nor as a boy seeking belonging, but as a shadow clinging to its source. He sheds blood at Askeladd's command, survives wars that are not his, and witnesses suffering that no child should endure, all for the promise of a fair duel. That promise becomes his ritual, a thin illusion of agency in a life otherwise stripped of choice. This is the cruel irony of Thorfinn's obsession. In chasing revenge, he forfeits autonomy. He imagines himself free because his goal is singular and absolute, but in reality, he is more controlled than anyone around him. Askeladd doesn't need chains. Thorfinn's hatred binds him more tightly than iron ever could. Years pass, and revenge offers nothing in return. However, his obsession only grows stronger. There is no growth in Thorfinn, only erosion. He doesn't develop ideals or friendships. He doesn't even truly live in the present. He exists in a permanent state of anticipation, of waiting for a moment that will supposedly give his suffering meaning. The world moves forward, kingdoms rise and fall, but Thorfinn remains frozen, orbiting the same rage like a dying star. What makes this obsession tragic is not its intensity, but its hollowness. Thorfinn is not chasing justice. He is clinging to anger because it's the only thing telling him who he is. Without revenge, there is no Thorfinn, only a void where a child should have grown. This is why his duels against Askeladd are so often failures. Thorfinn fights with a fury rather than thought, lunging forward on instinct, blinded by emotion. He mistakes rage for strength, intensity for resolve. Each loss reinforces the cycle. More anger, more obsession, more proof, at least in his own mind, that he must keep going. Strategy would require distance. Distance would require reflection, and reflection would mean confronting the truth that he has spent years avoiding, because the truth is unbearable. Revenge for Thorfinn is a facade built over trauma. It allows him to externalize his pain, to give his suffering a target rather than a shape. As long as Askeladd lives, Thorfinn can pretend that his misery has a purpose. He doesn't need to grieve. He doesn't have to ask what his father actually stood for. Hatred simplifies the world into something manageable. One enemy, one goal, one reason to wake up. But simplicity isn't healing. When revenge is stripped away from Thorfinn, what remains is emptiness. The obsession that sustained him collapses, and with it, his identity. He has no direction because he never learned how to choose one. His entire sense of self up to this point was constructed around a future moment that no longer exists. And so, when that future vanishes, so does he. This is the brilliance of Vinland Saga's portrayal of obsession. Revenge doesn't resolve Thorfinn's pain. It delays the moment that he must face it. It keeps him moving just long enough to avoid stillness. But once movement stops, the weight of everything he buried crashes down at once. Thorfinn's emptiness is not a punishment. It is a revelation. It exposes what obsession always hides. That devotion to a single consuming desire doesn't fill the self, it replaces it, and over time, there's nothing left underneath. In this sense, Thorfinn's obsession was a slow-burning prison that he willingly locked himself inside. The bars are made of memory, the walls are built from rage, and the key which is letting go, feels indistinguishable from death. To abandon revenge would mean admitting that the years of violence accomplished nothing, that his suffering didn't elevate him, that the world didn't bend to his pain, and yet that admission is the only path forward. What Thorfinn ultimately confronts is not Askeladd, but the terrifying possibility that he must live without a script. Without a singular enemy, life becomes ambiguous again, open, unforgiving. It demands responsibility rather than reaction, creation rather than destruction. In the end, Vinland Saga doesn't ask whether obsession is justified. It asks what remains after obsession has consumed everything else. And in Thorfinn's silence, after the shouting, after the killing, after the obsession burns itself out, we find the answer. Nothing. And from that nothing, something entirely different must be built. Attachment often begins as something necessary. It forms in moments of vulnerability, when the world feels unstable and something, or someone, becomes a source of safety. In its purest form, attachment gives people a reason to keep going. It creates bonds that ground identity, offering comfort in a world that is often unpredictable and cruel. But when that attachment is born from loss, when it becomes the only thing standing between someone and the emptiness that they once faced, it begins to change. It stops being something that supports a person and starts becoming something that they depend on to exist. Because when identity is built around a single person, that connection carries more than love. It carries fear. Fear of losing them, fear of returning to who you were before they existed in your life. And over time, that fear reshapes the bond itself. It becomes less about who that person is and more about what they represent. Not just companionship, but meaning. Not just connection, but survival. At that point, letting go doesn't just feel like moving on. It feels like losing everything all over again. Mikasa Ackerman from Attack on Titan doesn't choose her obsession in the same way others might. It is not something that she stumbles into through admiration or desire. It is forged in a moment of absolute loss, when the world strips everything away and leaves behind only fear, silence, and the unbearable weight of being alone. In that void, Eren Yeager does not simply save her life, he gives it structure, he gives it direction. More importantly, he gives it a reason to continue. Because of this circumstance, Eren is not just a person to Mikasa. He's more like the axis around which her entire existence turns. The scarf that he wraps around her is often remembered as an act of kindness, a symbol of warmth in a cold and indifferent world. But its meaning runs deeper than comfort. It is a tether, a quiet, invisible thread that binds Mikasa to the moment she was reborn. Not physically, but psychologically. That scarf represents belonging, safety, identity. It is not something she wears, it is something she returns to. A constant reminder that in a world defined by loss, there is still something she can hold on to. This is where obsession takes root, not in love alone, but in survival. Mikasa's obsession with Eren is built on trauma. When everything else is taken from her, he becomes the last remaining piece of a shattered world. To lose him would not simply be to lose someone she cares about, it would be to relive that original emptiness. And so, her devotion evolves into something absolute. She doesn't just care for Eren, she orbits him. Her purpose, her direction, even her sense of self begin to collapse inward, until they are indistinguishable from his existence. This manifests most clearly in her role as protector. Mikasa is constantly watching, intervening, stepping in before harm can reach him. She moves with a precision and urgency that borders on instinct, as if her body has internalized a single directive: keep Eren safe. On the surface, this appears selfless, an act of loyalty, even love. But beneath that surface lies a much more fragile truth. Protection, for Mikasa, is not just about Eren's survival. It is more so about maintaining the only structure that her identity rests upon. If Eren is safe, then her world remains intact. If he is threatened, then everything begins to unravel. This is what separates her from a typical guardian figure. A protector can exist independently of the person they protect. Mikasa cannot. Her sense of purpose is so tightly bound to Eren that imagining a life outside of him feels almost impossible. She does not ask what she wants, what she believes, or who she might become on her own. Those questions remain unanswered, buried beneath years of unwavering focus. Her feelings are not false. They are not shallow or constructed. They are deeply human, rooted in gratitude, love, and a desire to preserve what little remains after loss. But that sincerity is what traps her, because the more real her attachment is, the harder it becomes to question. To doubt her obsession with Eren would mean destabilizing the foundation of her entire reality. And so, even as Eren begins to change, growing more distant, more extreme, more unrecognizable, Mikasa clings not to who he is, but who he was. The boy who wrapped the scarf. The boy who gave her a home. The boy who made the world feel survivable. That version of Eren becomes a fixed point in her mind, untouched by time or transformation. It allows her to reconcile the growing dissonance between the person in front of her and the memory she refuses to let go of. In a sense, Mikasa is not just protecting Eren, she is protecting the meaning he once gave her. This is the quiet tragedy of her obsession. It does not blind her in the traditional sense. She sees the changes, she recognizes the distance, but recognition does not lead to rejection. Instead, it deepens her internal conflict. Because to accept who Eren has become would require her to confront the possibility that the foundation of her life is unstable, that the person she built herself around may no longer exist in the way she needs him to, and so she hesitates. This hesitation reaches its peak when Mikasa is forced into an impossible position, to choose between Eren and the world itself. Choosing the world means letting go of Eren. It means severing the tether that has defined her for so long. It means stepping into a version of herself that has never been fully realized. Because without Eren, then who is Mikasa? This question lingers beneath every decision that she makes. It is the question she has avoided since the very beginning, the one that obsession allowed her to bypass. As long as her purpose was clear, as long as her role was defined, she never had to answer it. But now, faced with the collapse of that role, she is left with nothing but uncertainty. And uncertainty is far more terrifying than loss. Loss can be understood, it can be grieved, processed, even accepted over time. But uncertainty demands creation. It asks for something new to take the place of what was lost. It requires the individual to define themselves without relying on external anchors. Mikasa's story reveals a different facet of obsession, one that is quieter, more restrained, but no less consuming. It does not manifest through destruction or outward chaos, but through stillness, through the inability to move forward, through the quiet insistence that what once was must remain unchanged, even as the world shifts around it. At its core, her obsession is about preservation, of memory, of meaning, of a version of the world that no longer exists. But preservation has its limits. There comes a point where holding on too tightly begins to distort the very thing being preserved, where love becomes fixation and devotion becomes confinement. Mikasa's journey is not about learning to stop caring. It is about learning to separate care from dependence, memory from identity, love from necessity. Because as long as Eren remains the center of her world, she can never truly stand within it herself. And so, her final act of killing Eren is not one of rejection, but of recognition. Letting go does not erase what Eren meant to her. It does not invalidate the years she spent protecting him, or the identity that she built in his presence. It simply creates space for something else to exist. For the first time, Mikasa is left without a script, without a singular purpose guiding her every action. What remains is uncertain, incomplete, and fragile. But it is hers. And in that fragile space, where obsession once dictated every thought and action, there is finally the possibility of something different. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a new life that does not depend on it.